in the sunlit halls of Ashford Manor, a dazzling diamond ring vanishes during a lively family reunion, plunging the Worthingtons into a web of suspicion. Was it the debt-ridden cousin, the envious aunt, the silent butler, or the charming stranger? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, unravelled secrets hidden in cigarette butts and whispered confessions, proving that even the smallest clue can expose a thief. Will the ring be found before the family's trust is shattered forever? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Ashford Manor. The late August sun dipped low over Ashford Manor, its golden light gilding the ivy-clad walls of the old Georgian estate in the heart of the English countryside. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and the hum of conviviality, for the Worthington family reunion was in full splendour. From the wide stone terrace, laughter mingled with the clink of crystal glasses, and the distant strains of a gramophone wafted through the open French windows. The scene was one of genteel merriment, yet beneath the surface, currents of tension and rivalry stirred, as they so often do when families gather. Miss Jane Marple, a distant cousin of the Worthingtons through a convoluted branch of the family tree, sat in a cushioned wicker chair at the edge of the terrace. Her frail figure, draped in a lavender shawl, belied the keenness of her mind. Her knitting needles moved with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, producing a soft grey scarf that grew imperceptibly with each stitch. To the casual observer, she was merely a quaint elderly spinster, absorbed in her handiwork, but her mild blue eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing. She noted the way young Clara Worthington, the radiant hostess, fluttered from guest to guest, her silk dress shimmering in the fading light. She observed Cousin Harold's loud guffaws, tinged with a forced joviality, as he regaled a group with tales of the racetrack. Aunt Beatrice, ramrod straight in her black bombazine, cast disapproving glances at the younger generation's levity. Mr. Jenkins, the butler, glided among the guests with a silver tray, his face a mask of professional neutrality. And then there was Mr. Lawrence Gray, a newcomer to the Worthington circle, whose polished manners and sharp-eyed interest in the proceedings set him apart. Clara, at 25, was the undisputed star of the gathering. Her chestnut curls bounced as she moved, and her laughter rang out like a bell. Around her finger gleamed a diamond ring, a family heirloom recently reset with a stone of remarkable clarity. It caught the light with every gesture, drawing murmurs of admiration. "Isn't it simply divine?" Clara exclaimed to a cluster of cousins, holding out her hand for inspection. "Father had it reset for me last month, you know. It's been in the family for generations, but it's never looked so splendid." Her pride was infectious, yet Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted a flicker of envy in Harold's eyes as he leaned closer to examine the jewel. Aunt Beatrice's lips tightened into a thin line, and Mr. Gray, standing nearby with a glass of sherry, studied the ring with an intensity that bordered on professional curiosity. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered the scene. She had attended many such gatherings in her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, and she knew well how family reunions could unearth old grudges or spark new ones. There was something about Clara's ring, she mused, that seemed to stir more than admiration. Harold's gaze lingered too long, his smile too strained. Beatrice's disapproval was almost palpable, as if the ring's prominence on Clara's finger was a personal affront. Jenkins, ever present with his tray, moved with a precision that suggested he saw and heard more than he let on. And Mr. Gray, well, his interest was altogether too keen for a mere guest. Miss Marple recalled a similar occasion in her village, when a ruby brooch had sparked covetous glances, and later, a petty theft. People, she thought, were much the same wherever one went. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, Clara called for the guests to gather for a toast. "To family," she declared, raising her glass, the diamond ring flashing brilliantly. The guests echoed her sentiment, though Miss Marple noted a certain hollowness in some responses. Harold's glass was raised a fraction too late, Beatrice's toast was curt, and Mr. Gray's smile did not quite reach his eyes. Jenkins, standing at the edge of the group, refilled glasses with a deft hand, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind as active as her fingers. The Worthingtons, for all their wealth and polish, were not so different from the villagers of St. Mary Mead. There was a story behind that ring, she was certain, and stories, in her experience, had a way of revealing themselves. As the evening deepened and the guests drifted toward the dining room, she tucked her knitting into her bag and followed, her quiet presence unnoticed amid the chatter. Something, she felt, was about to unfold at Ashford Manor, and she intended to be ready when it did. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Jewel. The grand drawing-room of Ashford Manor glowed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, their prisms casting delicate rainbows on the polished mahogany panelling. The Worthington family and their guests had retreated here after a sumptuous dinner, the air now heavy with the aroma of rich coffee and the faint tang of cigar smoke. The room buzzed with conversation, some lively, some subdued, as the guests settled into plush armchairs and velvet-upholstered sofas. Clara Worthington, still radiant in her emerald silk dress, moved among her relatives, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the low murmur of voices. On her finger, the diamond ring sparkled with every gesture, its brilliance drawing eyes like moths to a flame. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace with her knitting in her lap, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet attention, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the gathering. The room was a study in contrasts. Cousin Harold, his face flushed from wine, held court near the grand piano, regaling a small group with a tale of a near win at the Derby. His booming laugh grated slightly, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward Clara's ring whenever she passed. Aunt Beatrice, ensconced in a high-backed chair, sipped her coffee with a grimace, as if the brew, or perhaps the company, displeased her. Her black dress, severe and unadorned, seemed to absorb the light around her, and her sharp gaze followed Clara with a disapproval that was almost tangible. Mr. Jenkins, the butler, moved silently through the room, refilling cups and clearing dessert plates with a precision that bordered on mechanical. His face remained impassive, but Miss Marple, ever alert to the subtleties of human behaviour, caught the briefest flicker of his eyes toward Clara's hand as he passed her. Mr. Lawrence Gray, the art dealer, stood near a bookcase, his lean frame elegant in a tailored suit, his conversation with a young cousin punctuated by charming smiles and knowing glances at the ring. The atmosphere, though outwardly convivial, carried an undercurrent of tension, like a tightly wound spring waiting to uncoil. Clara, oblivious to the scrutiny her ring attracted, was in high spirits. She paused near a group of cousins, holding out her hand to show off the jewel once more. "Isn't it marvellous how it catches the light?" she said, her voice bright with pride. "Father said it's one of the finest diamonds in the county, and the new setting makes it positively modern." The cousins murmured their agreement, though Miss Marple noted a trace of envy in the eyes of young Emily, Clara's second cousin, who touched her own modest pearl ring self-consciously. The diamond, a large flawless stone set in a delicate gold band, seemed to command the room. Its presence as much a topic of conversation as the weather or the latest London gossip. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, the rhythm a soothing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She had seen such scenes before, in the drawing-rooms of St. Mary Mead and beyond, where a prized possession could stir emotions ranging from admiration to avarice. The ring, she mused, was more than a jewel. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and perhaps something deeper within the Worthington family. Her mind drifted to a case in her village, where a stolen locket had revealed not just theft, but a tangle of family secrets. She wondered what secrets this ring might uncover. The evening progressed, with the guests drifting into smaller groups. Clara moved to a card table, where she joined a game of bridge with Harold, Emily, and an elderly uncle. The third diamond flashed as she dealt the cards. And Miss Marple, from her vantage point, saw Harold's gaze linger on it again, his fingers tightening briefly around his cards. Aunt Beatrice, now joined by a dour-faced aunt from the north, muttered something about ostentatious displays that reached Miss Marple's ears. Mr. Gray, meanwhile, had struck up a conversation with Clara's father, Sir Henry Worthington, near the fireplace, their discussion of art punctuated by Gray's occasional glances toward the card table. Jenkins, ever present, refilled Sir Henry's coffee cup with a deferential bow, his movements so smooth they seemed almost invisible. It was just past 9 o'clock when the tranquillity shattered. Clara, rising from the card table to fetch a shawl from a nearby chair, let out a piercing scream that silenced the room. "My ring! It's gone!" she cried, holding up her bare left hand, her face pale with shock. The guests froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Harold leapt to his feet, knocking over a glass of port. Aunt Beatrice's coffee cup clattered into its saucer. Jenkins paused mid-step, a tray balanced in his hands, his expression unreadable. Mr. Gray turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Sir Henry, his face reddening, strode to his daughter's side. "What do you mean gone?" he demanded. "You were wearing it just moments ago." Clara's hands trembled as she recounted the evening. "I had it on during dinner and when we came in here for coffee. I was playing bridge, and I swear it was on my finger then. I only noticed it was missing when I went to fetch my shawl." Her voice broke, and she clutched her father's arm. "It can't have just slipped off. It fit perfectly." The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Sir Henry barked orders for the servants to search the drawing-room, and several cousins began peering under furniture and lifting cushions. Emily, her face flushed, suggested checking the dining-room where they had eaten earlier. Harold, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, muttered about the ring perhaps falling into the garden during cocktails. Aunt Beatrice, her voice icy, declared, "This is what comes of flaunting such things. Carelessness invites trouble." Mr. Gray offered to assist in the search, his tone calm, but his eyes sharp, as if calculating something. Jenkins, setting his tray aside, joined the servants in combing the room, his movements as methodical as ever. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She watched the chaos with a serene expression, though her mind was anything but idle. A missing ring, she knew, was rarely a simple matter of misplacement, especially when it held such value, both monetary and sentimental. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a sapphire bracelet had vanished during a garden party, only to be found in the pocket of a guest with a penchant for kleptomania. But this felt different. The ring's disappearance had an air of deliberation, and the reactions of those around her were telling. Sir Henry, his temper fraying, suggested calling the local constable, but Clara, tears welling in her eyes, protested. "Oh, father, not the police. Think of the scandal. It's a family matter. Surely we can resolve it ourselves." She turned to Miss Marple, her expression pleading. "Jane, you've solved mysteries before, haven't you? In your village? Please, you must help us. You see things others don't." Miss Marple inclined her head, her face softening with a reassuring smile. "I'm no detective, my dear," she said gently, "but I do notice things, and I'll do my best to help. Tell me everything you can about this evening." Her tone was calm, but her eyes were alight with interest, like a hunter catching the scent of a trail. Clara, still shaken, sat beside Miss Marple and recounted the evening's events. She had worn the ring all day, showing it off during cocktails on the terrace. She remembered Harold's teasing comment about pawning it to fund his next bet, which had made her laugh at the time. Aunt Beatrice had been nearby, her disapproval evident as she muttered about gaudy displays. Jenkins had been serving drinks, always within arm's reach, his tray a constant presence. Mr. Gray had admired the ring closely, asking about its cut and provenance, his questions almost too knowledgeable for a casual guest. Clara insisted she hadn't removed the ring, not even to wash her hands, as she'd been too proud of it to take it off. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloguing each detail. She asked Clara to describe the moments just before she noticed the ring was gone. "I was at the card table," Clara said, her brow furrowing. "I played 2 rounds of bridge, and I'm sure I felt the ring on my finger then. It's heavy, you see. It's not something you'd miss. When I stood to get my shawl, I glanced at my hand, and it was simply gone." Her voice trembled, and she wrung her hands. "It's not just the value, Jane. It's Mother's ring, and it means everything to me." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her touch light but comforting. There, my dear. We'll find it, or at least uncover what happened. Things don't vanish without reason." She glanced around the room, where the search continued in a disorganized frenzy. Harold was now on his knees, peering under a sofa, his face red with effort, or perhaps something else. Aunt Beatrice had resumed her seat, her expression one of barely concealed disdain. Jenkins directed a maid to check behind a curtain, his voice low but firm. Mr. Gray, standing near the door, watched the proceedings with an air of detachment, though his fingers tapped restlessly against his thigh. The search yielded nothing. The drawing-room, dining-room and terrace were scoured, with servants lifting rugs and guests checking their own pockets in a show of goodwill. The garden, where cocktails had been served, was searched by lantern light, but the grass revealed no glint of diamond or gold. Sir Henry, his patience exhausted, declared the effort futile for the night. "We'll resume in the morning," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Clara, you must rest. We'll get to the bottom of this." As the guests dispersed, some to their rooms, others to linger in hushed conversations, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting untouched. She thought of the ring, its weight and brilliance, and the emotions it had stirred. Harold's jest about pawning it, Beatrice's scorn, Jenkins's silent efficiency, Gray's calculating interest. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that people often betrayed their intentions in the smallest ways. A glance, a hesitation, a word too carefully chosen. She would watch and listen and wait. Rising at last, she tucked her knitting into her bag and made her way to her room. Her steps slow but purposeful. The ring was gone, but its absence had set something in motion, and Miss Marple was determined to follow where it led. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, "is a curious thing, and it has a way of revealing itself, given time." Chapter 3. The suspects emerge. The morning after the diamond ring's disappearance dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's breakfast room. The cheerful clatter of porcelain and silverware did little to dispel the pall that hung over the Worthington family. The guests still gathered for the reunion spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to Clara, who sat pale and subdued at the head of the table, her bare hand hidden beneath a napkin. Miss Jane Marple, seated near a window with a view of the manicured lawns, sipped her tea and observed the room with her usual quiet acuity. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, untouched for now, as her mind worked over the events of the previous evening. The loss of the ring had stirred the household like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples were revealing much about those caught in their wake. Sir Henry Worthington, his face set in a grim line, presided over the breakfast with a forced air of normalcy, though his frequent glances at Clara betrayed his concern. The other guests, cousins, aunts, and a few distant relations, picked at their eggs and toast, their conversations stilted. Cousin Harold, his usual boisterousness dimmed, buttered his toast with unnecessary vigour, his eyes avoiding Clara's. Aunt Beatrice, her black dress as severe as ever, sat ramrod straight, her thin lips pursed, as she stirred her tea with deliberate precision. Mr. Jenkins, the butler, supervised the servants with his customary efficiency, his expression as unreadable as a blank page. Mr. Lawrence Gray, the art dealer, was conspicuously absent, though Miss Marple had overheard a maid mention he was taking a morning walk in the grounds. The absence of his polished presence was notable, and Miss Marple filed it away for later consideration. Clara, breaking the strained silence, spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. "I still can't believe it's gone," she said, her eyes fixed on her empty coffee cup. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it on my finger, as if it were all a bad dream." Her father reached over to pat her hand, but his gesture was awkward, his frustration evident. "We'll find it, Clara," he said gruffly, "or we'll find who took it." The word "took" hung in the air, sharpening the tension. Several guests exchanged glances, and Miss Marple noted the quick flush that rose to Harold's cheeks, the slight tightening of Beatrice's grip on her spoon, and the way Jenkins' eyes flickered briefly toward the table, before resuming their neutral gaze. Miss Marple set her teacup down with a soft clink, her mind already turning to the task at hand. She had promised Clara her help, and she intended to keep that promise, not through dramatic flourishes, but through the patient observation that had served her so well in St. Mary Mead. A stolen ring, she knew, was rarely just about the jewel itself. It was about what it represented: wealth, status, or perhaps a grudge long nursed in secret. She recalled a case in her village where a pilfered silver spoon had uncovered a web of jealousy among neighbours. Here, among the Worthingtons, the stakes were higher, but the principles, she suspected, were much the same. Rising from the table, she excused herself with a polite murmur and made her way to the morning room, a quiet space overlooking the rose garden. She settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting bag at her side, and began to consider the suspects. There were 4 who stood out, each with opportunity and perhaps motive. Harold, with his gambling debts and careless jests about pawning the ring. Aunt Beatrice, whose disapproval of Clara bordered on resentment. Mr. Jenkins, whose silent omnipresence gave him access to every corner of the evening's events. And Mr. Gray, whose interest in the ring had been too keen, too knowing, for a mere guest. Miss Marple's needles began to move, the soft click a counterpoint to her thoughts as she planned her approach. She would speak to each in turn, not as an inquisitor, but as a kindly old lady whose questions seemed harmless enough. People, she had found, often revealed more when they thought themselves unobserved. Her first opportunity came soon after breakfast, when she found Harold lingering in the hall, adjusting his tie in a gilt-framed mirror. His reflection showed a man uneasy, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. Miss Marple approached with a smile, her voice gentle. "Harold, my dear, you look quite out of sorts this morning. I do hope the loss of Clara's ring hasn't upset you too much." Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way his fingers fumbled with the knot of his tie. Harold turned, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Upset? Not at all, Miss Marple. Just a bit of a shock, that's all. Poor Clara's in a state," though he ran a hand through his hair, his gaze sliding away from hers. "Probably just misplaced it, don't you think?" "These things turn up." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Perhaps," she said, "though a ring like that doesn't simply slip off a finger. You were near Clara during cocktails, weren't you? I seem to recall you admiring it." Her tone was light, but the question was deliberate, testing his reaction. Harold's smile faltered, and he coughed, loosening his tie as if it was suddenly too tight. "Admiring it?" "Oh, just a glance, you know. Stunning thing, but not my sort of interest. I was chatting with the cousins most of the evening, hardly noticed the ring." His words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, caught pilfering from a church collection plate, whose nervous chatter had betrayed him just as surely. "And where were you during the bridge game?" she asked, her voice as soft as ever. "I don't recall seeing you at the card table." Harold hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "Oh, I was about. Talking to old Uncle George, I think. Or was it Emily? Hard to keep track with all of the to-do his vagueness was telling," and Miss Marple smiled, letting the silence stretch. Harold shifted his weight, then excused himself with a muttered remark about needing air, leaving her alone in the hall. Her next encounter was with Aunt Beatrice, whom she found in the conservatory, inspecting a pot of wilting ferns with a critical eye. Beatrice's black dress seemed out of place among the lush greenery, and her expression was as stern as the starched collar at her throat. Miss Marple approached, her knitting bag slung over her arm, and commented on the beauty of the orchids nearby. "Such delicate things," she said, "and yet they require such care. Rather like family heirlooms, don't you think?" Beatrice's lips twitched, as if suppressing a retort. "Heirlooms are only as valuable as the care they're given," she said sharply. "Clara's carelessness with that ring was bound to lead to trouble." Her tone carried a weight of disapproval, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around the handle of a small trowel. "Carelessness?" Miss Marple echoed, her voice mild. "I suppose it's easy to misjudge. You were near Clara during cocktails, weren't you? I recall you speaking to her just before dinner." Her question was casual, but her eyes watched Beatrice closely. Beatrice's gaze snapped to hers, then softened into something closer to disdain. "I was reminding her of propriety," she said. "That ring is a family treasure, not a bauble to be flaunted." I was in the drawing-room afterward, correcting young Thomas's manners. He can confirm it. Her alibi was firm, delivered with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Yet Miss Marple sensed a brittleness beneath her composure, as if the ring's loss touched a nerve deeper than mere disapproval. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled her knitting from her bag. "Of course," she said, "it's so easy to lose track of time at these gatherings. I do hope the ring is found soon. It means so much to Clara." Beatrice's only response was a curt nod before she turned back to her ferns, dismissing the conversation. Later, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Jenkins, finding him in the pantry, polishing a set of silver candlesticks with meticulous care. His dark suit was immaculate, his movements precise, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders as she approached. "Mr. Jenkins," she said warmly, "you manage this household so beautifully. It must be quite a task, keeping track of everything during such a large gathering." Jenkins inclined his head, his expression polite but guarded. "Thank you, madam. It's my duty to ensure everything runs smoothly." His voice was even, but Miss Marple caught the briefest pause before he resumed polishing. "You were serving drinks last evening, weren't you?" she asked, her tone conversational. "So many people about. It must be hard to notice everything. Did you happen to see Clara's ring during the bridge game?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of unease. Jenkins's hand paused mid-polish, then resumed. "I was attending to the guests, madam," he said. "I served Miss Clara's table during the game, but I didn't notice the ring specifically." My attention was on the service his words were measured, his alibi supported by the guests who had seen him moving through the room. Yet Miss Marple recalled a butler in St. Mary Mead, whose loyalty to a troubled family member had led to a small theft. And she wondered what loyalties, or temptations, might lie behind Jenkins' calm facade. Mr. Gray proved harder to pin down, as he had not yet returned from his walk. Miss Marple made a mental note to seek him out later, intrigued by his absence and the rumours of his dubious past in London. For now, she returned to the morning room, her knitting resumed as she sifted through what she had learned. Harold's nervousness, Beatrice's resentment, Jenkins' guarded efficiency, Each offered a glimpse into possible motives. The ring's disappearance was no accident, she was certain, and the key lay in understanding who had the most to gain or the most to hide. As she knitted, her thoughts turned to a case in her village where a stolen watch had revealed not just a thief, but a family's unspoken grievances. The Worthingtons, she suspected, held similar secrets, and the ring was merely the spark that would bring them to light. She would continue to watch, to listen, and to ask her gentle questions, knowing that the truth, like her knitting, would take shape one stitch at a time. Chapter 4. A Conversation with Harold. The late morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's billiard room, casting long shadows across the green baize table. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and old leather mingling with the sharper note of brandy from a half-empty decanter on a sideboard. Cousin Harold Worthington stood alone, leaning against the table, a glass in one hand and a cue in the other. Though the balls were neatly racked and untouched, his usual jovial demeanour was absent, replaced by a restless energy that manifested in the way he tapped the cue against his polished shoe. Miss Jane Marple, entering the room with her knitting bag slung over her arm, noted the tension in his posture and the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as if he expected an interruption, or perhaps dreaded one. She had chosen this moment deliberately, knowing Harold's habit of retreating to the billiard room when the rest of the household was occupied with morning calls or strolls. Her approach was as unassuming as ever, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her steps soft on the polished floor. "Harold, my dear," she said, her voice warm with the gentle concern of an elderly relative. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought I might find a quiet spot to do a bit of knitting, but it seems you've claimed this room for yourself." Her smile was disarming, and she settled into a leather armchair near the window, her needles already clicking softly as she drew out a skein of grey wool. Harold started slightly, his grip tightening on the cue. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a cough. "Not disturbing at all. Just, thinking of a game, but I'm not much in the mood." He set the cue down with a clatter and took a sip of brandy, his movements jerky. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the faint tremor in his hand, and she recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, caught pilfering from a neighbour's till, whose hands had shaken just so when questioned. "I quite understand," she said, her tone sympathetic. "It's been a trying time for everyone, with poor Clara's ring gone missing. Such a beautiful thing and so dear to her. I suppose you must feel it keenly, being so fond of her." Her words were carefully chosen, a gentle probe disguised as idle chatter, and she watched as Harold's face flushed, his eyes darting to the side. "Fond? Oh, yes, Clara's a fine girl," he said quickly, setting his glass down with a thud. "Terrible business, that ring. Probably just slipped off somewhere, don't you think? She'll find it under a cushion or in the garden." His optimism sounded forced, and Miss Marple noted the way he avoided her gaze, focusing instead on a non-existent speck on the billiard table. "Perhaps," she said, her needles pausing as she tilted her head. "Though it's curious, isn't it? A ring like that, so heavy and well-fitted, doesn't just vanish. You were near Clara during cocktails, weren't you? I seem to recall you joking about it. Something about pawning it for a good bet." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but her eyes were sharp, catching the sudden stiffening of Harold's shoulders, so he laughed, a brittle sound that echoed in the quiet room. "A joke, Miss Marple. Just a bit of fun. I'd never. Well, you know how it is, saying silly things after a few drinks." He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. "I was with the cousins all evening anyway." Didn't have time to notice much about the ring. His words tumbled out too quickly, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a village lad who had stammered in much the same way when caught with a stolen watch. "Indeed," she said, resuming her knitting. "These gatherings can be so lively, it's hard to keep track of everyone. Though I did hear something about your recent visit to the races. Newmarket, was it? I suppose you must have had quite a time." Her comment was casual, but she watched him closely, noting the way his face paled slightly, his fingers twitching as if longing for the brandy glass. "Newmarket. Oh yes, a bit of sport," he said, his voice strained. "Didn't do as well as I'd hoped, but that's the way of it. Nothing I can't handle." He forced another smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, and Miss Marple recalled the gossip she'd overheard at breakfast. Harold's debts had grown alarmingly, his creditors less patient than his family. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's gambling had led him to pawn a neighbour's silver, believing he could replace it before anyone noticed. Harold's unease suggested a similar desperation, though she kept her expression one of kindly interest. "And during the bridge game," she continued, her voice as soft as her knitting, "where were you then?" "I don't recall seeing you at the card table with Clara." Her question hung in the air, and she watched as Harold's composure wavered, his hand reaching for the brandy glass before stopping halfway. "Oh, I was about," he said vaguely, his eyes fixed on the window. "Talking to Uncle George, I think, or maybe it was Cousin Philip." Hard to say with all the comings and goings, his alibi was flimsy, and Miss Marple noted the lack of conviction in his tone. In her experience, those with nothing to hide were precise in their recollections, while the guilty often cloaked themselves in vagueness. She smiled, letting the silence stretch, knowing it would unsettle him further. Harold shifted his weight, his fingers drumming on the billiard table. "Look, Miss Marple, I don't know what you're getting at, but I had nothing to do with Clara's ring. I'm as upset as anyone." His voice rose slightly, a defensive edge creeping in, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding. "Of course, my dear," she said. "I only thought you might have seen something, being so close to Clara that evening. You young people are so observant." Her flattery was deliberate, and she saw a flicker of relief in his eyes, though it was quickly replaced by wariness. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically as she added, "It's such a pity about the ring. I do hope it's found soon for Clara's sake, and for everyone's peace of mind." Harold muttered something about needing to speak to Sir Henry, and excused himself, his departure more hurried than necessary. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his reactions, the nervous laughter, the vague alibi, the sheen of perspiration on his brow. He was hiding something, she was certain, though whether it was the theft of the ring or merely his own financial troubles remained to be seen. She thought of the village grocer's son, whose gambling debts had led to a rash act of theft, and how his guilt had shown in the same restless gestures Harold displayed. The ring, she suspected, was a temptation too great for a man in Harold's position, but she would need more than suspicion to be sure. Rising from her chair, she tucked her knitting into her bag and made her way to the window, looking out over the lawn where a few guests strolled. Harold's figure was visible in the distance, heading toward the stables, his pace quick and purposeful. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "People are so predictable," she murmured to herself, "and yet so very complicated." She would speak to the others, Beatrice, Jenkins, and the elusive Mr. Grey, but for now, Harold's discomfort was a thread she would follow, one stitch at a time, until the pattern of the truth emerged. Chapter 5. Aunt Beatrice's Disdain. The library at Ashford Manor was a haven of quiet, its high shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and the air scented with the faint must of old paper and beeswax polish. The tall windows admitted slants of midday light, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily above the Persian rug. Aunt Beatrice sat in a wing-backed chair near a rosewood table, a book of sermons open before her, though her eyes were fixed not on the page, but on some distant point, her expression as unyielding as the black bombazine she wore. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed a tension that contrasted with the serene setting, and Miss Jane Marple, entering the room with her knitting bag, noted the subtle rigidity in Beatrice's posture. It was the kind of stiffness she had seen in St. Mary Mead, in A Vicar's Wife, who harboured a grudge against a rival for the flower-arranging committee. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic gentleness, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her steps soft on the rug. "What a peaceful spot, Beatrice," she said, her voice warm and unhurried. "I do hope I'm not intruding." "I thought the library might be just the place for a bit of quiet knitting, but I see you've claimed it for your reading." She settled into a nearby chair, her needles emerging from her bag with a soft clink, and began to work on her grey scarf, the rhythmic click a soothing counterpoint to the silence. Beatrice's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if assessing an opponent. "No intrusion, Jane," she said, her voice crisp and clipped. "I find the library a refuge from the chaos of this household. Clara's misfortune has everyone in a tizzy, and I prefer to avoid such histrionics." Her tone carried a note of disdain, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around the edges of her book, the knuckles whitening briefly. "Oh, quite," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she met Beatrice's gaze with a mild smile. "It's such a shock losing something so precious. Poor Clara is quite distraught, and no wonder, with the ring being a family heirloom. I suppose it must hold special meaning for you too, being part of the Worthington legacy." Her words were carefully chosen, a gentle probe into Beatrice's feelings about the ring, which Miss Marple suspected stirred more than mere disapproval. Beatrice's lips thinned, and she closed her book with a deliberate snap. "The ring is a symbol of family pride, or it ought to be," she said. "Clara treats it like a trinket, flashing it about as if it was some gaudy prize from a fair. It belonged to my sister, you know, Clara's mother, and it should have been mine by rights, as the elder. But Henry insisted on giving it to Clara." Her voice was steady, but there was a bitterness in it, like a cold wind cutting through a warm day. And Miss Marple recalled a spinster in her village who had nursed a similar resentment over an inherited cameo brooch. How difficult that must be, Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. Family heirlooms carry such weight, don't they? I remember you were near Clara during cocktails, when she was showing off the ring. You must have noticed how much attention it drew. Her question was casual, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of unease in Beatrice's composed facade. Beatrice's expression hardened, her hands folding tightly in her lap. I noticed her lack of decorum, she said sharply. She was practically waving it under everyone's noses, inviting trouble. I told her as much, but she laughed it off, as she always does. I was in the drawing room later, correcting young Thomas for his slovenly manners. He can vouch for me. Her alibi was delivered with the precision of a schoolmistress. And Miss Marple nodded, recalling that Thomas, a lanky nephew, had indeed mentioned Beatrice's lecture during breakfast. Of course, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. It's so easy to lose track of time at these gatherings, isn't it? Though I suppose you must have seen who was near Clara during the bridge game, when the ring went missing. Her voice was soft, almost absent-minded, but her question was deliberate, testing Beatrice's reaction. Beatrice's gaze snapped to hers, a flash of irritation in her eyes. I was not watching Clara's every move, she said. I had better things to do than monitor her carelessness. The drawing room was full of people. Any one of them could have taken it, if it was taken at all. She likely dropped it somewhere, and is too proud to admit it. Her words were dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice, a crack in her otherwise impervious demeanour. It reminded her of a saint. Mary Mead Matron, who had denied involvement in a petty theft, only to betray her guilt through a nervous tic. Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle understanding. You're quite right, Beatrice. These things are often simpler than they seem. Though it's curious, isn't it, how a ring so cherished could vanish so completely? I do hope it's found soon for Clara's sake, and for the family's harmony. Her words were kind, but they carried a subtle challenge, and she watched as Beatrice's lips tightened further, her fingers smoothing the cover of her book as if to steady herself. Harmony, Beatrice repeated, her tone dry. This family has little of that, Jane, and Clara's recklessness only makes it worse. If she treated the ring with the respect it deserved, we wouldn't be in this mess. She rose abruptly, her book clutched to her chest. If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. Her departure was brisk, her black skirts rustling like dry leaves, and Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloguing the exchange. Beatrice's resentment was palpable, rooted not just in the ring's loss, but in its very possession by Clara. Miss Marple thought of the cameo brooch case again, where envy had driven a woman to hide her sister's treasure out of spite. Beatrice's alibi, confirmed by young Thomas, was solid, but alibis, Miss Marple knew, could be constructed as carefully as a house of cards. Her disapproval of Clara, her sense of entitlement to the ring, and her sharp reaction to questioning all suggested a motive, though whether it extended to theft remained unclear. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she sat alone in the library, her thoughts turning to the other suspects. Harold's nervousness had been revealing, but Beatrice's bitterness added a new layer to the mystery. Jenkins and Gray still awaited her scrutiny, and she would seek them out in due course. For now, she considered Beatrice's words, her rigid demeanour, and the way her hands had betrayed her composure. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that envy could be as powerful a motive as greed, and Beatrice's resentment of Clara's youth and privilege was a thread worth following. Rising from her chair, she tucked her knitting into her bag and made her way to the door, pausing to glance at the shelves of books. They reminded her of the stories people told themselves about their rights, their grievances, their justifications. The ring's disappearance was unravelling such a story, and Miss Marple was determined to read it to its end, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Butler's Routine. The pantry at Ashford Manor was a model of order, its shelves lined with gleaming silverware and neatly stacked china, the air tinged with the sharp scent of polish and the faint warmth of beeswax. Mr. Jenkins, the butler, stood at a long oak table, his sleeves rolled up precisely to his elbows, methodically cleaning a set of crystal decanters. His movements were as deliberate as a metronome, each stroke of the cloth precise, his face a study in calm efficiency. The afternoon light filtered through a small window, casting a soft glow on his dark suit, and Miss Jane Marple, entering quietly with her knitting bag, noted the almost ritualistic quality of his work. It reminded her of a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, whose meticulous pruning had masked a deeper unease when questioned about a missing trowel. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice warm and unintrusive, "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I was just admiring how beautifully you keep everything in order. It must be quite a responsibility, managing a household like this during such a large gathering." She settled onto a wooden stool near the table, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft clink, and began to work on her grey scarf, the steady click a soothing backdrop to the quiet room. Jenkins glanced up, his expression polite but guarded, a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, betraying a momentary unease. "Thank you, madam," he said, his voice even and measured. "It's my duty to ensure the household runs smoothly, no matter the occasion." He resumed his polishing, the cloth moving in slow, deliberate circles, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause in his rhythm, as if her presence had briefly disrupted his composure. "Oh, indeed," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "You manage it so well, one hardly notices the effort. Last evening, for instance, you were everywhere, weren't you? Serving drinks, seeing to the guests' comfort. I suppose you must see and hear a great deal in the course of your duties." Her tone was conversational, almost absent-minded, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of reaction in Jenkins's impassive face. He inclined his head, his hands never faltering. "I do my best to be attentive, madam," he said, "but my focus is on the service, not on the guests' personal matters." His words were carefully chosen, and Miss Marple recalled a saint. Mary Mead housekeeper, who had used similar phrases to deflect questions about a pilfered silver spoon, her loyalty to a wayward nephew later revealed as the motive. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle, "though with something as striking as Clara's ring, it's hard not to notice, isn't it? I believe you were serving at her table during the bridge game when the ring went missing. Did you happen to see it on her finger then?" Her question was soft, almost incidental, but she watched closely as Jenkins's hand paused mid-stroke, the cloth hovering over the decanter for a fraction of a second before resuming. "I was serving coffee at the time, madam," he said, his voice as steady as before. "I didn't notice the ring specifically." My attention was on ensuring the guests had what they needed. His alibi was consistent with the accounts of several guests who had seen him moving through the drawing room with his tray. But Miss Marple noted the precision of his response, as if it had been rehearsed. She thought of a case in her village, where a footman's flawless routine had concealed a small theft, driven by a desperate need to aid a struggling sister. "You're so very thorough," she said, her needles clicking rhythmically. "It must be challenging, keeping track of everyone in such a busy evening." "I suppose you were near Clara quite often, serving drinks during cocktails and later in the drawing room. Did you notice anyone paying particular attention to her ring?" Her question was gentle, but it carried a subtle challenge, and she watched as Jenkins's eyes flickered briefly toward her before returning to his task. "There were many admiring the ring, madam," he said. "Miss Clara was showing it to several guests during cocktails. I recall Mr. Harold making a jest about it and Mr. Gray asking about its craftsmanship. But I was focused on my duties, not their conversations." His tone remained even, but Miss Marple caught the slightest tightening of his jaw, a sign of discomfort that reminded her of a Saint Mary Mead's servant who had known more than he admitted about a missing brooch. She nodded, her expression one of kindly interest. "How thoughtful of you to remember such details," she said. "It's remarkable how much you must observe, even without meaning to. I suppose you've been with the Worthingtons for some time, long enough to know the family's ways." Her comment was an invitation, and she watched as Jenkins' hands slowed, his cloth lingering on the decanter's curve. "I've served the family for nearly 20 years, madam," he said, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "It's a position of trust, and I take it seriously." He set the decanter down with care, aligning it precisely with the others, and Miss Marple noted the faint gleam of a new pocket watch at his waist, its chain catching the light. It was an unexpected touch of extravagance for a man of his station, and she filed it away, recalling a village butler whose sudden acquisition of a fine watch had hinted at undisclosed income. 20 years is a long time, she said, her needles pausing as she met his gaze. "You must feel quite devoted to the family." "It's such a pity about Clara's ring. It means so much to her, and to Sir Henry, I'm sure. I do hope it's found soon, for everyone's sake." Her words were kind, but they carried a subtle weight, and she watched as Jenkins' expression remained impassive, though his fingers brushed the watch chain briefly, as if to reassure himself. "Indeed, madam," he said, "I hope it's recovered as well. If you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." He bowed slightly, his movements as precise as ever, and turned to place the decanter on a shelf. Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and offered a warm smile. "Of course, Mr. Jenkins," she said. "Thank you for indulging an old lady chatter. I'll let you get on with your work." She made her way to the door, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind already sifting through the exchange. Jenkins' composure was nearly flawless, but the brief pause in his polishing, the touch of his watch chain, and the careful neutrality of his answers suggested a man accustomed to guarding his thoughts. She thought of the saint, Mary Mead footman again, whose loyalty had led him to shield a thief, and wondered what loyalties or temptations might lie behind Jenkins' polished exterior. As she stepped into the corridor, she glanced back to see Jenkins resume his work, his movements as steady as before, but his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bearing an unseen weight. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Loyalty is a fine thing," she murmured to herself, "but it can lead people to the most curious actions." She would seek out Mr. Gray next, but for now, Jenkins' watch and his guarded responses were threads in the tapestry she was weaving, and she would follow them as carefully as she followed the stitches in her knitting. Next, Chapter 7, The Mysterious Mr. Gray. The rose garden at Ashford Manor was a symphony of colour and fragrance, its neatly trimmed bushes bursting with late summer blooms under the soft afternoon light. The gravel paths wound through arches of climbing roses, their petals scattering gently in the breeze, and Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, strolled slowly along one such path, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She had heard from a housemaid that Mr. Lawrence Gray, the elusive art dealer, favoured this secluded spot for his morning walks, and she had chosen this moment to seek him out, knowing that a casual encounter often yielded more than a formal interrogation. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes scanning the garden with the quiet attentiveness that had served her so well in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had once been traced through a chance remark overheard in a village garden. As she rounded a corner, she spotted Mr. Gray standing near a stone bench, his lean figure immaculate in a tailored grey suit, a cigarette held loosely between his fingers. He was studying a particularly vibrant rose, with an intensity that seemed more professional than leisurely, and Miss Marple noted the way his sharp eyes flicked up as she approached, his smile quick and polished, like a well-rehearsed performance. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak, "what a pleasant surprise! I wouldn't have thought you one for garden strolls, but this place is quite the treasure, isn't it?" He gestured to the roses, his manner charming, but Miss Marple caught the slight wariness in his gaze, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who had once tried to charm his way out of a petty theft accusation. "Oh, I do enjoy a garden," she said, her voice warm and unhurried, as she paused to admire a cluster of pink blooms. "There's something so calming about roses, don't you think? Though I confess, I'm no expert like you must be, Mr. Gray, with your eye for beautiful things." She settled onto the bench, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a soft clink, and began to work on her grey scarf, the steady click a gentle counterpoint to the rustle of leaves. Her compliment was deliberate, designed to put him at ease, and she watched as his smile widened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You flatter me, Miss Marple," he said, extinguishing his cigarette with a practised flick and taking a seat beside her. "My expertise lies more in paintings and jewels than flowers, but I appreciate beauty in all its forms." His tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the bench, a small tell that suggested he was not as relaxed as he appeared. "Jewels, of course," she said, her needles pausing as she met his gaze with a mild smile. "I couldn't help but notice how much you admired Clara's ring the other evening. Such a splendid piece, and you seem to know a great deal about it. Its cut, its provenance, You must have seen many fine gems in your work." Her words were gentle, but they carried a subtle probe, and she watched as Gray's expression flickered, a momentary tightening at the corners of his mouth. "It was a remarkable stone," he said, his voice smooth but careful. "A diamond of that clarity is rare, and the setting was modern but elegant. I couldn't resist asking Clara about it. Professional curiosity, you see." He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his posture relaxed. But Miss Marple caught the slight tension in his shoulders, like a man bracing for a question he'd rather not answer. She recalled a charming antique dealer in her village whose smooth talk had hidden a scheme to pass off stolen goods, and Gray's polished demeanour struck a similar chord. "Quite understandable," she said, resuming her knitting. "You must see all sorts of treasures in your line of work. I suppose you were near Clara during cocktails, when she was showing the ring to everyone. Did you notice anyone else taking a particular interest in it?" Her question was casual, almost absent-minded, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Gray's fingers stilled briefly before resuming their tapping. He shrugged, a gesture too casual to be entirely natural. "Oh, everyone was admiring it, weren't they? Harold made some joke about its value, and Aunt Beatrice seemed less than impressed, but that's to be expected. I was chatting with Sir Henry most of the evening, about a Gainsborough he's thinking of selling, actually. Didn't pay much attention to the ring after that." His alibi was smooth, but Miss Marple noted its weakness. Sir Henry had mentioned their conversation, but it had been brief, leaving Gray's whereabouts during the critical hour of the bridge game unaccounted for. "How fascinating," she said, her needles clicking rhythmically. "A Gainsborough must be quite a prize, though I imagine a diamond like Clara's would be tempting to someone in your trade, wouldn't it? So easy to slip into a pocket, if one were so inclined." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but her words were a deliberate nudge, and she watched as Gray's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tempting, perhaps," he said, his voice still smooth but with a faint edge. "But I deal in legitimate transactions, Miss Marple. Stealing doesn't suit my style." He chuckled, but it sounded forced, and Miss Marple recalled the antique dealer again, whose charm had crumbled under scrutiny, revealing a man with a past he preferred to keep hidden. "Of course," she said, her smile gentle. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just so puzzling, isn't it? A ring like that vanishing without a trace. I suppose you were in the drawing room during the bridge game when it went missing. Did you see anything unusual?" Her question was soft, but it carried a weight, and she watched as Gray's fingers paused, his gaze drifting to the roses as if seeking an escape. "I was in and out," he said, his tone vague. "Talking to a cousin about some etchings, I think. It was a busy evening, hard to keep track of everyone. His alibi was as flimsy as Harold's." And Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on a distant bloom. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that vagueness was often a shield for those with something to hide, and Gray's evasive answers were telling. She nodded, her needles moving steadily. "It must be difficult, being a guest in such a lively household," she said. "I heard you've had some success in London, with your gallery." Though there was some talk, forgiven old ladies' gossip, about a bit of trouble there recently. Nothing serious, I'm sure. Her comment was a gentle prod, and she watched as Gray's face stiffened, his charm faltering for a moment. Trouble?" he said, his voice cool. "Just the usual business rivalries, Miss Marple. London's art world is full of rumours, but I assure you, my reputation is intact." He rose, brushing an imaginary speck from his sleeve, his smile returning, but less convincing than before. "If you'll excuse me, I should check on a telegram I'm expecting. Delightful chatting with you." His departure was swift, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he moved toward the house. Miss Marple remained on the bench, her knitting in her lap, her mind sifting through the exchange. Gray's charm was undeniable, but it was a polished surface over something less certain. His interest in the ring, his vague alibi, and the hint of a troubled past in London, all were threads in the tapestry she was weaving. She thought of the saint, Mary Mead antique dealer again, whose smooth talk had masked a history of dubious dealings, and wondered what Gray's polished exterior might conceal. His absence during the morning's search and his evasive answers suggested he was a man with secrets, and the ring's disappearance might well be one of them. Rising slowly, she tucked her knitting into her bag and made her way back toward the manor, her eyes lingering on the roses. "Beauty can be so deceptive," she murmured to herself, "and so can charm." She had spoken to Harold, Beatrice and Jenkins, and now Gray. Each had revealed a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. The ring's absence was a catalyst, stirring motives and secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to follow each thread, one careful stitch at a time, until the truth bloomed as clearly as the roses around her. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Grass. The morning sun rose higher over Ashford Manor, bathing the estate in a warm, golden glow that belied the unease lingering within its walls. The terrace, where cocktails had been served 2 evenings prior, stretched along the south side of the house, its flagstones bordered by manicured flower beds, and a low balustrade overlooking the sweeping lawn. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl wrapped snugly against the slight chill of early September, walked slowly along the terrace, her eyes scanning the ground with the quiet precision of a naturalist seeking rare specimens. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a familiar companion, but her hands were free, her attention wholly absorbed by the scene before her. The loss of Clara's diamond ring had cast a shadow over the Worthington family reunion, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the small details that others overlooked, had resolved to revisit the place where the ring had last been prominently displayed. The terrace was quiet now, the lively chatter of the cocktail hour replaced by the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Miss Marple paused near a cluster of rose bushes, their blooms still vibrant despite the season's turn, and crouched slightly, her eyes tracing the edge of the flagstones. She recalled Clara's animated gestures during cocktails, the diamond ring flashing as she laughed and gestured, drawing the attention of Harold, Beatrice, Jenkins, and Mr. Gray. The ring had been on her finger then, Clara had insisted, and Miss Marple believed her. A jewel of such weight and significance was not easily misplaced. In St. Mary Mead, she had once found a missing earring beneath a garden bench, its discovery unravelling a tale of envy, and she wondered if this terrace might yield a similar clue. As she moved along the path, her gaze fell on a small crushed object half hidden in the grass, where the flagstones met the flower bed. She bent closer, her fingers deftly retrieving a cigarette butt, its tip stained with ash, and bearing the distinctive gold band of a brand she had seen Harold smoking the previous day. The butt was pressed into the soil, as if stepped on carelessly, and its position, directly beside the spot where Clara had stood during cocktails, struck Miss Marple as significant. She turned it over in her hand, noting its freshness. It had not been there long enough to be weathered by rain or dew. Tucking it carefully into a small envelope from her bag, she straightened, her mind already weaving possibilities. Harold's nervous demeanour in the billiard room, his vague alibi, and now this cigarette butt, placed him near Clara at a critical moment. She recalled a case in her village where a discarded matchstick had led to a thief's undoing, and she wondered if this small find might point to a similar truth. Continuing her inspection, Miss Marple's eyes caught a faint scuff mark on the flagstone nearby, a subtle abrasion that suggested something small and hard, perhaps a ring, had been dropped and retrieved in haste. The mark was fresh, its edges sharp, and it lay just beyond the rose bush, where someone might have stepped briefly out of sight. She crouched again, her fingers brushing the stone, and noted a tiny speck of gold dust, barely visible, clinging to the rough surface. It was not enough to be conclusive, but it was enough to stir her curiosity further. In St. Mary Mead, a smudge of polish on a windowsill had once betrayed a burglar's entry, and this scuff mark, coupled with the cigarette butt, suggested a moment of opportunity seized by someone close to Clara. Miss Marple rose, her expression serene, but her mind alert. The terrace had been bustling during cocktails, with guests mingling and Jenkins serving drinks, yet the cigarette butt and scuff mark pointed to a fleeting, deliberate act. Harold's presence was strongly implied, but she cautioned herself against jumping to conclusions. Beatrice's resentment, Jenkins' guarded efficiency, and Gray's evasive charm were still threads in the tapestry, and she would need to examine them all before the pattern became clear. For now, the cigarette butt was a tangible clue, and she would keep it close, like a stitch held on her knitting needle, ready to be worked into the hole. She made her way back toward the house, pausing to glance at the rose bushes once more. The garden was peaceful, but it held secrets just as the villagers of Sunt. Mary Mead had hidden their motives behind smiles and pleasantries. As she reached the terrace doors, she saw Clara emerge, her face still pale, but her eyes bright with a fragile hope. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, "have you found anything? Father says we should call the police, but I can't bear the thought of it." "Not yet." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her touch light but reassuring. "Nothing certain, my dear," she said, her voice gentle, "but I've found a small something that might help. We must be patient, you know. These things have a way of revealing themselves." She did not mention the cigarette butt or the scuff mark, knowing that speculation could cloud Clara's already troubled mind. Instead she smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, Jane. I don't know what we'd do without you." She turned back to the house, and Miss Marple followed, her mind already turning to the next step. The cigarette butt linked Harold to the scene, but it was not proof of theft, only of presence. She would need to observe him further, perhaps in a setting where his guard was down, and she would need to speak to the others again, testing their stories against this new evidence. As she entered the house, she glanced back at the terrace, its flagstones gleaming in the sunlight. Small things, she murmured to herself, can tell such large stories. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that a single clue, like a dropped stitch, could unravel a mystery if followed with care. The cigarette butt and scuff mark were such clues, and she would follow them, one careful step at a time, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 9. The Family's Secrets. The afternoon tea at Ashford Manor was a ritual of refined elegance, served in the long drawing-room, where the Worthington family and their guests gathered around low tables laden with delicate porcelain cups, silver teapots, and platters of scones and cucumber sandwiches. The room, with its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, hummed with subdued conversation. But the air was thick with the unspoken tension of Clara's missing diamond ring. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair near a window, her knitting needles moving steadily as she worked on her grey scarf, her eyes flitting from one guest to another with the quiet attentiveness of a bird-watcher. The cigarette butt and scuff marks she had found on the terrace were tucked away in her mind, like stitches held for later, and she was content to listen, to observe, and to let the family secrets surface in the unguarded moments of tea-time chatter. Clara, still pale but composed, poured tea with a trembling hand, her bare ring finger a stark reminder of her loss. Sir Henry, at the head of the room, maintained a gruff air of authority, though his frequent glances at his daughter betrayed his concern. Cousin Harold, seated near a tray of pastries, picked at a scone with uncharacteristic restraint, his usual boisterousness muted. Aunt Beatrice, her black dress absorbing the light, sipped her tea with a grimace, as if the brew, or the company, left much to be desired. Mr. Jenkins, the butler, oversaw the service with his usual precision, directing maids with a nod so subtle it was barely perceptible. Mr. Lawrence Gray, returned from his morning walk, lounged near a bookcase, his polished charm undimmed but his eyes sharp, scanning the room as if appraising a gallery of paintings. Miss Marple noted each detail, her mind weaving connections as deftly as her needles shaped her scarf. The conversation, at first stilted, began to flow as the tea warmed the guests' spirits. A young cousin, Emily, ventured a tentative remark about the weather, prompting a murmur of agreement. But it was Clara who shifted the topic, her voice soft but clear. "I can't stop thinking about the ring," she said, setting her cup down with a clink. "It's not just the value, you know. It was Mother's, and I feel as if I've lost her all over again." Her eyes glistened, and Miss Marple noted the way Harold's fingers froze on his scone, crumbs scattering onto his plate. Sir Henry cleared his throat, his face reddening. "We'll find it, Clara," he said gruffly, "or we'll find who took it. No one leaves this house until we do his words," meant to reassure, sharpened the tension, and Miss Marple saw several guests exchange glances, their expressions ranging from unease to defiance. It was Emily who broke the silence, her voice hesitant. "Clara, didn't Harold ask you for a loan just before the reunion? I heard him talking about it in the hall." Her words were innocent, but they landed like a stone in a pond, sending ripples through the room. Harold's face flushed a deep crimson, and he coughed, nearly choking on his tea. "A loan?" he sputtered, his napkin crumpled in his fist. "Just a bit of family talk, Emily. Nothing serious." I'd never... Well, it's not as if I needed it desperately. His protest was too quick, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to Clara, who looked startled but nodded slowly. "It's true," Clara said, her voice uncertain. "He asked a few days ago, but I didn't have the funds to spare." I thought nothing of it. Her words were kind, but they carried a weight, and Miss Marple recalled a saint. Mary Mead, shopkeeper, whose request for a loan had preceded a theft, driven by mounting debts. Aunt Beatrice set her cup down with a sharp clink, her lips curling in disdain. "Debts are a family failing, it seems," she said, her voice cutting. "Though I'd have thought Harold would have more pride than to beg from Clara. And as for that butler—" She glanced at Jenkins, who stood impassive near the door. "I've noticed a new watch on him. Far too fine for a servant's wages." Extravagance is a dangerous habit. Her accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple saw Jenkins's hand twitch briefly toward his pocket, where the watch chain gleamed, before he resumed his stance, his face a mask of neutrality. Sir Henry frowned, his gaze shifting to Jenkins. "Is that true, Jenkins?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusing. "A new watch?" Jenkins bowed slightly, his voice calm. "A gift from my late mother's estate, sir," he said. "A small inheritance, nothing more." His explanation was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the faint tension in his posture, reminiscent of a saint. Mary Mead's servant who had claimed a similar windfall to explain a sudden acquisition. Before the conversation could deepen, a cousin from the north, a garrulous woman named Margaret, chimed in. "And what about Mr. Gray?" she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "I heard he left a London gallery under a cloud. Something about a disputed painting. Not that I'm one to gossip, but it's odd, him being so interested in Clara's ring." She glanced at Gray, who raised an eyebrow, his smile unfaltering but his eyes cool. "Gossip travels fast, doesn't it?" Gray said, his tone light but edged. "A misunderstanding, nothing more. My interest in the ring was purely professional. Fine jewels are part of my trade." He sipped his tea, his composure intact, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened briefly around the cup, a small sign of strain. The room buzzed with these revelations, each snippet a thread in the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving. Harold's loan request, Jenkins' watch, Gray's rumoured past, each added depth to the mystery of the ring's disappearance. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen bracelet had been traced through overheard conversations at a church tea. The villagers' unguarded remarks revealing motives and opportunities. Here, the family's secrets were spilling out in much the same way, and she listened intently, her needles moving faster as the pieces began to align. Clara, sensing the growing tension, attempted to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Let's not accuse each other," she said, her voice pleading. "I just want the ring back. It's all that matters." But her words did little to quell the undercurrent of suspicion, and Miss Marple noted the way Harold avoided her gaze. Beatrice's lips tightened. Jenkins remained statue-like, and Gray's smile grew thinner. As the tea service concluded, Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "Such a lovely gathering," she said, her voice warm, "despite the circumstances. I do hope we'll have good news about the ring soon." Her words were polite, but her mind was racing, cataloguing the revelations. Harold's financial strain, Beatrice's pointed accusation against Jenkins, and the whisper of scandal surrounding Gray. Each was a clue, like the cigarette butts she had found, and she would need to test them against the others' stories. Stepping into the corridor, she paused, her eyes lingering on the drawing-room's heavy drapes, which seemed to hold the weight of the family's secrets. Words, she murmured to herself, are such revealing things if one listens closely. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that gossip, though often unreliable, could point to truths hidden beneath the surface. The ring's disappearance was peeling back layers of the Worthington family, and Miss Marple was determined to follow each thread, one careful stitch at a time, until the pattern of the truth emerged. Chapter 10. A trap is set. The dining room of Ashford Manor glowed softly under the flicker of candlelight, its long mahogany table set with gleaming silver and fine china for the evening meal. The Worthington family and their guests, dressed in formal attire, gathered with a semblance of festivity, though the shadow of Clara's missing diamond ring hung heavily over the assembly. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the foot of the table in her simple lavender dress, her knitting bag tucked discreetly at her side, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. The revelations from the afternoon tea, Harold's loan request, Jenkins' new watch, and the whispers of Gray's dubious past had woven a complex tapestry in her mind, and she sensed the moment was ripe to stir the waters further. In St. Mary Mead, she had once resolved a mystery over a stolen locket by prompting the guilty to reveal themselves through a carefully laid trap, and she resolved to try a similar approach tonight. Clara, seated beside her father, Sir Henry, wore a strained smile, her bare hand resting lightly on the table, a stark contrast to the sparkle that had once adorned it. Sir Henry's face was set in a determined frown, his eyes scanning the guests as if searching for a telltale sign of guilt. Cousin Harold, his tie slightly askew, took frequent sips from his wine-glass, his laughter louder than necessary, as if to mask his unease. Aunt Beatrice, her black dress as severe as her expression, cut her food with precise, almost aggressive motions, her disapproval of the gathered company palpable. Mr. Jenkins, overseeing the service with his customary precision, moved silently among the footmen, his face an unreadable mask. Mr. Lawrence Gray, polished and composed, engaged a cousin in light conversation, though his eyes darted occasionally toward Clara, as if gauging her mood. Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind, each observation a stitch in the pattern she was forming. As the soup course was cleared, Miss Marple leaned toward Clara, her voice low and conspiratorial. "My dear," she murmured, "I've been thinking about your ring, and I wonder if we might try something to encourage its return. In my village, I once saw a lost brooch recovered when the owner offered a reward, no questions asked. It can loosen tongues, you know, or prompt a guilty conscience to act." Her suggestion was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Watching Clara's reaction, Clara's face brightened, a flicker of hope breaking through her distress. "Do you think it could work, Jane?" she whispered. "I'd give anything to have it back, and I don't care who took it, as long as it's returned." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do it. I'll announce it tonight." Miss Marple smiled, patting Clara's hand. "That's the spirit, my dear. Make it clear the reward is generous, and watch how everyone reacts. People often betray themselves when they think they're safe. She leaned back, her expression serene, but her mind was alert, anticipating the ripples this announcement might create. As the main course was served, a succulent roast with all the trimmings, Clara rose, her hands clasped nervously before her. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "I have something to say," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "The ring means more to me than I can express, and I want it back, no matter how it's returned. I'm offering a substantial reward for its return, no questions asked. If anyone knows anything or has it, please just bring it to me, and we'll say no more about it." Her words were earnest, and she sat down quickly, her cheeks flushed, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. Harold's wine-glass paused halfway to his lips, his face paling as he set it down with a slight clink, his eyes fixed on his plate. Aunt Beatrice's fork stilled, her lips pursing into a thin line, as if the very idea of a reward offended her sense of propriety. Mr. Jenkins, pouring wine for Sir Henry, continued his task without a flicker, though Miss Marple noted the slightest tightening of his grip on the decanter. Mr. Gray's smile froze, his eyes gleaming briefly with something like calculation, before he resumed his conversation, his voice a shade too bright. Sir Henry nodded approvingly, though his frown deepened, as if he suspected the reward might complicate matters further. The other guests murmured, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, and the room buzzed with a renewed undercurrent of tension. Miss Marple observed it all, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind cataloguing each reaction. Harold's pallor suggested a fear of exposure, perhaps tied to his debts and the cigarette butts she had found on the terrace. Beatrice's disdain hinted at a deeper resentment, possibly rooted in her belief that the ring should have been hers. Jenkins' calm was too perfect, like the saint, Mary Mead footman who had maintained a flawless facade while concealing a stolen watch. Gray's fleeting gleam of interest suggested a mind quick to weigh opportunities, much like the charming swindler she had encountered in her village. The reward, she knew, would act like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples that might dislodge the truth. As dinner progressed, Miss Marple excused herself briefly, citing a need for fresh air, and slipped into the corridor. From there she moved quietly toward the library, where a telephone sat on a side table. She had overheard a snippet of conversation earlier, when a maid mentioned Harold using the telephone after tea, his voice low and urgent. Positioning herself near the door, she listened as the dinner continued, her ears attuned to the muffled sounds of the house. Sure enough, within minutes she heard hurried footsteps, and Harold appeared, his face flushed as he picked up the receiver. His voice was hushed but audible, and Miss Marple's sharp ears caught his words. "I'll have the money soon, I swear. Just give me a day or two." He paused, listening, then added, "No, it's under control. I'll handle it." He hung up quickly, his breath uneven, and hurried back to the dining room, unaware of Miss Marple's presence in the shadows. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. Harold's call confirmed his financial desperation, a motive that aligned with the cigarette butt and scuff mark on the terrace. Yet she cautioned herself against certainty. The other suspects remained in play. As dessert was served, a delicate lemon tart, she caught a glimpse of Jenkins clearing a table, his movements as precise as ever. But his hand slipped briefly, tucking a small object into his pocket. It might have been a spoon, as butlers often handled stray cutlery, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the quickness of the gesture, as if he feared being seen. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's hasty concealment of a stolen brooch had looked much the same, and she filed the observation away. The dinner concluded with strained pleasantries, the guests dispersing to the drawing-room or their private quarters. Miss Marple lingered, thanking Clara for her courage in making the announcement. "You did well, my dear," she said softly. "Now we must watch and wait. People often act when they feel the net closing." Clara nodded, her eyes grateful, and Miss Marple made her way to her room, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. As she climbed the stairs, she murmured to herself, "A trap is only as good as the reactions it provokes." In St. Mary Mead, a similar reward had flushed out a thief, and here the ripples were already spreading. Harold's call, Jenkins's secretive gesture, Beatrice's scorn, and Gray's calculating glance were all threads in the tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together, one careful stitch at a time, until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The drawing-room of Ashford Manor was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its heavy velvet curtains drawn against the evening chill. The Worthington family and their guests had gathered after dinner, some lingering over coffee, others attempting to restore a semblance of normalcy with card games or quiet conversation. Yet the air was taut with expectation. The announcement of Clara's reward for the return of her diamond ring still reverberating through the household. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner armchair, her knitting bag at her side, observed the room with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her grey scarf lay folded in her lap, untouched for now, as her mind wove together the threads of evidence she had gathered. The cigarette butt, the scuff mark, Harold's desperate phone call, Jenkins' secretive gesture, Beatrice's bitterness, and Gray's evasive charm. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unravelled a theft by bringing the guilty to account in a single, carefully orchestrated moment, and she sensed that such a moment was now at hand. Clara, seated near the fireplace, looked weary but resolute, her bare hand clasped tightly around a coffee cup. Sir Henry, pacing near the window, cast occasional glances at the assembled guests, his frustration barely concealed. Cousin Harold, his face flushed from wine, fidgeted with a pack of cards, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Aunt Beatrice, rigid in her black dress, sat with a book she did not read, her lips set in a line of disapproval. Mr. Jenkins, stationed near the sideboard, supervised the serving of drinks with his usual precision, though Miss Marple noted the faint tension in his posture, as if he sensed the gathering storm. Mr. Lawrence Gray, leaning casually against a bookcase, sipped a brandy, his polished smile intact but his eyes watchful, like a man anticipating a challenge. The other guests, cousins and distant relations, murmured among themselves, their voices a low hum that underscored the room's unease. Miss Marple, after a quiet word with Clara and Sir Henry during dessert, had persuaded them to allow her to address the gathering. She rose now, her small figure commanding attention despite her unassuming demeanour, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle but clear, carrying the authority of one accustomed to being heard. "I've been asked to say a few words about Clara's missing ring, and I hope you'll indulge an old lady's attempt to bring some clarity to this troubling matter." Her eyes twinkled, but there was a firmness in her tone that silenced the room, all eyes turning to her. She moved to the centre of the room, her steps slow and deliberate, her hands clasped before her. "The ring's disappearance has caused great distress," she continued, "and I've been observing, as I often do in my quiet way, the events of the past few days. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small things, a word, a glance, a misplaced item, can reveal the truth, and here, I believe, we have such clues." She paused, letting her words settle, noting the way Harold's fingers tightened on his cards. Beatrice's book closed with a soft thud, Jenkins' hand paused mid-motion, and Gray's smile faltered briefly. "First," she said, "there's the cigarette butt I found on the terrace, near where Clara stood during cocktails. A brand favoured by Harold, and fresh, suggesting someone lingered close to her at a critical moment." Harold's face reddened, his mouth opening to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture gentle but commanding. "Then there's the scuff mark, with a trace of gold dust, as if something small was dropped and retrieved in haste. A ring, perhaps." She let the implication hang, her eyes sweeping the room. "Harold," she said, turning to him, her voice soft but piercing, "you were near Clara that evening, joking about pawning the ring. Your debts, I've heard, are pressing, and your call last night, promising payment soon, suggests a desperate need. The cigarette butt places you at the scene." Harold's cards scattered across the table, his hands trembling as he stammered, I didn't take it, Miss Marple. I swear it was just a joke." She nodded, her expression kind but unyielding. "Perhaps," she said, then turned to Beatrice. "Aunt Beatrice, your resentment of Clara's possession of the ring is no secret. You felt it should have been yours, and your disapproval was evident. Yet your alibi, confirmed by young Thomas, is strong. Still, envy can be a powerful motive." Beatrice's lips tightened, her eyes flashing with indignation, but she remained silent, her hands gripping her book. To Jenkins she said, "Mr. Jenkins, your efficiency is admirable, but your new watch, so fine for a butler's means, raises questions. You were near Clara all evening, with every opportunity to act. Your calm is almost too perfect." Jenkins's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple caught the briefest flicker in his eyes, like a curtain twitched aside. Finally, she turned to Gray. "Mr. Gray, your interest in the ring was more than casual, and your past in London, clouded by rumour, suggests a man familiar with opportunity. Your alibi for the bridge game is vague, and your absence this morning was curious." Gray's smile tightened, his fingers tapping his glass, but he offered no defence, only a slight shrug. "The ring," Miss Marple concluded, "was taken by someone desperate, someone who stood close to Clara, who knew its value, and who needed money urgently." Her eyes rested on Harold, whose face had drained of colour, his hands now clenched into fists. "Harold, my dear, you've been under such strain. The ring was a temptation, wasn't it? A quick solution to your troubles, hidden away until you could act." The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Harold's shoulders slumped, his breath coming in short gasps. "All right," he burst out, his voice breaking. "I took it. I didn't mean to keep it forever. just to pawn it for a loan, to pay off my debts. I was going to return it, I swear." He buried his face in his hands, his confession echoing in the stunned silence. "It's in my room, in my suitcase, wrapped in a handkerchief." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Sir Henry's face darkened with anger. Beatrice's expression softened, a flicker of pity crossing her stern features. Jenkins remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, and Grey's smile returned, though it held a trace of relief. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet satisfaction, like a knitter who had just completed a complex pattern. There," she said softly to Clara, who had risen to her feet, tears in her eyes. "It's found now, my dear. That's what matters." She turned to Sir Henry, her voice gentle but firm. "I trust you'll handle this as a family matter, Sir Henry. Harold's actions were foolish, but his heart may not be as guilty as his hands." In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen how a confession could heal as much as it hurt, and she hoped the Worthingtons would find a similar resolution. As the guests began to murmur, some in shock, others in relief, she returned to her chair, her knitting bag a comforting weight at her side. The truth had emerged as it always did, through the small things, cigarette butts, scuff marks, and the unguarded moments of human nature. Chapter 12. The resolution. The morning after Harold's confession cast a subdued calm over Ashford Manor, as if the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath. The grand drawing-room, where the confrontation had unfolded, was now bathed in soft sunlight, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, its polished surfaces gleaming with a quiet dignity. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking gently as she worked on her grey scarf, the rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the lingering echoes of the previous evening's drama. The Worthington family, though still shaken, moved through the morning with a tentative sense of relief, their conversations hushed but no longer strained with suspicion. Clara, her eyes brighter despite the shadows beneath them, stood near the fireplace, clutching a small velvet box that held the recovered diamond ring. Miss Marple observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her mind reflecting on the threads she had woven to unravel the mystery, much as she had done in St. Mary Mead, when a stolen locket had revealed a family's hidden tensions. The recovery of the ring had been swift, following Harold's tearful admission. Sir Henry, his face a mixture of anger and relief, had accompanied Harold to his room, where the young man retrieved the ring from his suitcase, wrapped carefully in a monogrammed handkerchief. The diamond, still dazzling in its modern gold setting, was returned to Clara with a mixture of apologies and assurances from Harold that he had intended only to borrow its value temporarily. Clara, though shaken, accepted the ring with trembling hands, her fingers tracing the familiar weight of the heirloom that had belonged to her mother. The family had gathered briefly to witness the moment, a quiet tableau of reconciliation, and Miss Marple had watched from her corner, her heart warmed by the restoration of Clara's treasure, though her mind remained alert to the undercurrents of human nature that had surfaced. Now, as the family breakfasted in the dining room, the mood was one of cautious mending. Sir Henry, seated at the head of the table, spoke in low tones to Clara, his voice gruff but tender, urging her to consider the matter closed. "Harold's a fool, But he's family, he said, his hand resting briefly on hers. We'll sort it out privately. Clara nodded, her fingers curled protectively around the ring, now back on her hand, its sparkle a quiet reminder of the ordeal. Aunt Beatrice, her black dress as stern as ever, sat with a softer expression, her earlier disdain replaced by a grudging acceptance of Harold's remorse. Mr. Jenkins, serving coffee with his usual precision, moved with a subtle ease, as if relieved of some unseen scrutiny. Mr. Lawrence Gray, his polished charm undimmed, announced his departure for London later that day, citing business obligations, though Miss Marple noted the haste in his preparations, as if he sought to distance himself from the manor's recent turmoil. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened as the family discussed Harold's future. Clara, her voice gentle but firm, insisted he seek help for his gambling habits. "I can't bear to think of you in such trouble again," she said, her eyes meeting his across the table. Harold, his face drawn and pale, nodded, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet shame. "I'll try, Clara," he murmured, his hands clasped tightly before him. "I never meant to hurt you." Sir Henry, though stern, agreed to arrange for Harold to meet with a financial adviser, and there was talk of a stint abroad to distance him from his creditors. Miss Marple, recalling a young man in St. Mary Mead who had been saved from ruin by a similar intervention, felt a flicker of hope for Harold's redemption. As breakfast concluded, Clara approached Miss Marple, the velvet box now tucked away, the ring gleaming on her finger. "Jane," she said, her voice thick with gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you. You saw what we couldn't, what I didn't want to see. You've given me back more than just the ring." Her eyes glistened, and Miss Marple patted her hand. Her touch, light but warm. There, my dear," she said softly. "It's only what anyone might have done, watching closely. People are much the same, you know, whether in St. Mary Mead or here at Ashford Manor. They make mistakes, but they can mend them. Given a chance, her smile was kind, her eyes crinkling with the wisdom of countless small mysteries solved through patient observation. The other guests began to disperse, some to pack for their departure as the reunion drew to a close, others to stroll the grounds, seeking solace in the manor's gardens. Aunt Beatrice, pausing by Miss Marple's chair, offered a rare nod of acknowledgement. "You've a sharp eye, Jane," she said, her voice less sharp than before. "I misjudged you." Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles clicking softly, accepting the compliment with the grace of one accustomed to being underestimated. Mr. Jenkins, clearing the table, met her gaze briefly, his expression one of quiet respect. The question of his watch, though unanswered, seemed less pressing now, a detail that might belong to another story. Mr. Gray, his suitcase already in the hall, offered a polished farewell, his smile as charming as ever, but his eyes guarded, as if he knew he had escaped closer scrutiny. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind noting the similarity to a saint. Mary Mead swindler who had left the village just as suspicion began to gather. Some mysteries, she knew, remained unsolved, and Gray's true intentions would likely stay his own. As the household returned to its routines, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way to her room, her steps slow but purposeful. The ring's return had restored a measure of peace, though the Worthingtons, like any family, would carry the scars of their secrets. She thought of her village, where human nature played out in smaller dramas, and smiled faintly. Families, she murmured to herself, are such intricate patterns, but they can be mended, stitch by stitch. Settling into her chair by the window, she resumed her knitting, the grey scarf growing steadily under her deft fingers. The case of the missing diamond ring was closed, its solution a testament to the power of small things. Cigarette butts, scuff marks, and the unguarded moments that revealed the heart's truths. As she worked, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, knowing that Ashford Manor, like St. Mary Mead, would continue to tell its stories, and she would always be ready to listen.